Footsteps in the desert. Footsteps that changed the world. 2,000 years ago, an itinerant Jewish preacher set out. In the Holy Land, he preached renewal and love. He would be killed, but his message would survive. The story of Christianity, an endless procession of humanity, a road through the centuries full of error and confusion, full of devotion and passion, not made of historical dates, but rather lived by human beings. A story of suffering, but also a story of joy. The crucified rabbi from Nazareth, his life had exerted a stronger effect on humanity than all the great deeds of kings and emperors. A fascinating phenomenon, and an eternal miracle which also touches our own century and our future. Germany in rubble and ashes, Europe destroyed. When American reconnaissance forces took these shots over Berlin on March 14, 1945, the Nazi nightmare of the so-called Thousand-Year Reich had come to an end. A rude awakening awaited the survivors, full of depression and confusion after a war that put into the shade every form of organized brutality humans had ever had to endure before.
All in all, this time was marked by despair over the crimes that had come to light and the immeasurable suffering that had afflicted so many people. Then something else affected people's confidence in their faith, leading to questions that were hard to answer, such as, in the age of Auschwitz, how can we sing a chorale of praise and gratitude to God?
Wie kann man in einer Zeit, in der wir hören, was sich mit dem Begriff Auschwitz verbindet, einen Choral zum Lob und zum Dank Gottes singen?
But they were filled, the churches, or whatever was left over from them. Christian faith is a last source of stability. The confession of its own guilt helped Germany reopen contact with other nations. The Reverend Martin Niemöller pronounced it on behalf of the Protestant churches.
We accuse ourselves of not having more courageously confessed, more loyally prayed, more happily believed, and more warmly loved. The problem lies in the question of who will take this guilt upon himself, confess it, and who will deal with it so that it does not remain with us like a mute curse, allowing our lives to wither and decay.
It was Christians like Pastor Niemöller, himself persecuted under the Third Reich, who were able to awaken international confidence in a new beginning for Germany. Christians built the bridge, for instance, to the World Church Convention. In 1948, church representatives from 44 nations founded this ecumenical council of churches in Amsterdam. The catastrophe of World War II had made everybody aware that we must maintain a view of the whole world if we want to get a grip on the problems of humanity. The Vatican, however, refused to attend the gathering, which sought to make a summing up in the shadow of the Depression following the World War. Catholicism stuck to its millennia-old stance that it was the only true church. Not for another decade in 1960 would the progressive Pope John XXIII break down this Catholic rigidity. He sought contact with the world's churches. The door to ecumenism, to a community with all Christian churches, was opened. Christianity's great opportunity in the 21st century.
This was, as I see it, inspired by the Spirit of God, and that is why I think this ecumenical movement is more powerful than all the opposing tendencies that might be more easily explainable in worldly terms. This is the great hope, and when we speak of the opportunities for Christianity in the 21st century, then we must bear in mind the prerequisite that we can only take advantage of them together in a joint effort across the boundaries of individual confessions.
Great opportunities, but even greater perils. The first explosion of an atomic bomb opened a new chapter in history. Humanity now possessed the possibility of totally destroying its world. In the laboratories of Oak Ridge as early as the first part of 1945, people were already playing with fire. Papers from the Development Center document this gigantic recklessness. Gregory Bright, that was the name of the physicist whose job it was to calculate whether the first atomic ignition sparks would set the whole world on fire. The possible hazard of a nuclear chain reaction could not be eliminated. Day-long calculations, then the scientist's verdict. The probability is rather low. A rather low probability of the world coming to an end? The scientists were willing to take their chances on this residual risk factor that 16th of July. For the first time, human beings had put all their money on a single card, and the scientists enthusiastically called it progress.
Was it progress that the atom bomb was invented? Was it progress that people were able to discover more subtle ways of killing, that experiments could be carried out on human beings, and so on? What really is progress? Merely greater aptitude, or, for it to be regarded as progress, must there not be another aspect, one that appeals to what I called a farther-reaching dimension? And I would say a new aptitude that doesn't open up a new possibility for human beings to be human in a positive sense is no progress.
A new dimension of being human? In the 50s, it was happening somewhere else, in the department stores. The economic miracle determined the new rhythm of life. Capitalism and consumerism versus reflections on faith and religious tradition. For the churches in those days, this represented a new challenge, which gained increased focus from the East-West conflict. In the West, it was the promise of a consumer's paradise. In the East, a disestablishment of the churches through communist dreams. Perhaps one belief had the most lasting impact on our own present day, the belief in money. The present day. This largely means economic growth rates, increased productivity, consumerism with exploding demands, a development that sets the pace for the whole Western world. The reality of the stock exchange. This is nothing but a new faith, full of prophecies and promises, full of heaven and hell. The cathedrals of this cult, these are the banks and insurance company buildings, which reach up to touch the heavens.
The businessmen are replacing the priests. They promise salvation from all misery, the creation of equality, happiness for everyone. In other words, a radicalized paradise in the here and now. This is an idea that has taken hold of people more and more over the last decade, and that's what I find so odd about it. Never before in human history has one idea begun to dominate every spirit.
Merely paper? Paper people believe in. Paper that divides the world in have-nots and those who buy the right to do whatever they please. Outside the doors of the great commercial capitals, we find the profoundest poverty and misery, buffered by governments that are chasing after the promises of the business community, more or less successfully. Behind it, the army of the hopelessly beaten down, which keeps increasing in size. Over the last 30 years, the number of extremely impoverished countries has doubled to 48. Globalization and free trade? What do these people get from it? Joint world economy and enormous capital flow? Are these the prescriptions for progress? Who will accept the responsibility? The stockbrokers? The politicians? And when we look at these scenes, can we even endure the fact that 80% of the world's property is in the hands of only some 220 people?
The greatest challenge is unquestionably fighting poverty. And this must be combined with a fortified educational initiative, certainly not in terms of our standards. We must find out what these people themselves want. Another important factor is the timely recognition of conflicts that could turn into acts of violence, and the formation of international organizations that are in a position to diffuse them. That is my dream, so to speak.
Internationalen Organisationen, die dazu in der Lage sind, das wäre sozusagen mein Traum.
Peace amongst the peoples. An aspiration as old as the Christian message, and one that has been beaten down time and again for just as long. First and foremost, it is ethnic conflicts that are breaking out, such as in South Africa. The confrontation between white and black is like a symbol of human failure, for our inability to conceive of ourselves as a human family. South African Bishop Desmond Tutu is fighting for people to learn to see themselves as the common creation of God.
We have an incredible sense that, as we used to say to our people, this is God's world. Truth and goodness and love and laughter are going to have the last word. And we're seeing it. We're seeing how lies have been exposed, how injustice has been overthrown. And we know that ultimately goodness will prevail.
Decades ago, this dream was dreamed by the Baptist minister, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I have a dream we may be able to sit down.
I have a dream, he told a gigantic audience in Washington in the summer of '63. The dream of a reconciled society, of a promised land where justice and love among humans would prevail. The old Christian ideal for which Jesus lived and for which he was crucified.
I have a dream.
On April the 4th, 1968, this Christian civil rights advocate fell victim to a racist attack. But his message could not be gunned down. Hundreds of thousands of people began demonstrating for reconciliation. A new era in Rome as well. The gathering at the Second Vatican Council in October of 1962 became a demonstration of a church that sought to eliminate all national and ethnic barriers. A mood of renewal in a place that ranked over the last 2 centuries as a bastion of rigid traditionalism. A renewal of Catholic teachings in church life, a reform of the liturgy, an opening up toward other churches. These were the innovations that Pope Paul VI announced to the world at the solemn conclusion of the Council in 1965. Reforms that made profound changes in Catholicism.
We are still involved with the reception of the Second Vaticanum, a great historical explosion, if I may call it that. We need time to make it our own, and that is an arduous process. But I think the most important thing is new courage to make sure Christianity retains its function in the modern world as well. It must again reflect on the fact that it will always need reforms, and yet it must continue to maintain its significance in the modern world.
The Catholic Church opened up to the modern age and the world. Pope John Paul II was called the traveling pope. The Christian faith must surmount all national and ethnic boundaries. That is his firm conviction. No other Western statesman has traveled across the forgotten continent of Africa as exhaustively as has John Paul II. A demonstrative attempt to give people courage. People who have long been written off by the movers and shakers of the industrial nations. The conservative Catholic and the Marxist revolutionary. Pope John Paul visited the Cuban head of state, Fidel Castro. Political hurdles that were once considered insurmountable are now being vaulted. The great totalitarian phantasms of this century, which capsized in blood, have abdicated. Violent ideologies are being replaced by greater focus on people, a new opportunity for Christianity, as it is for the political scene.
The main thing we have to learn is to deal humanely with one another in all our diversity. If Christians take their concept of inborn dignity seriously, independent of any accomplishments, any language or belief, then they must make their contribution to the effort of living together in peace and being diverse without fear.
Friedlich miteinander zu leben und ohne Angst verschieden zu sein.
The churches in Germany may be empty on Sundays, as people are constantly saying. Church resignations may number in the hundreds of thousands annually in both the Catholic and Protestant faiths, as statisticians calculate. But the old Christian promise is certainly not imperiled by this. The effect of the Christian message cannot be measured by the size of the church buildings or the number of people attending religious services. Holy Scripture, its spirit has long since begun waving in other places. For example, here, in Madurai, South India. What the people are celebrating here is a Christian communion service. These are Catholic Jesuits dressed as Buddhist monks, celebrating a Christian rite with Indian ingredients. Fire, cleansing rituals, mantra chants, Indian sandalwood and the bells of transformation, all that fits in here with bread and wine, the body and blood of Christ.
Why did you let that person cuss you out and then you forgave him? I'm on my way home and you're not the
And this too is Christianity in practice.
I'm on my way home. I want to thank him for being my all in all. On my way, on my way, on my way, on my way home.
An American gospel service. That's how much joyful energy the message of Jesus is capable of unleashing. Christianity, that means freedom. That means diversity of religious forms which bear the imprint of a country and its people, and which always represents part of an unmistakable cultural history. A touch of home which can also rise again from forgetfulness, as it did in Russia, where 10 years after the fall of communism, every fourth young person confesses his allegiance to the Orthodox Church. Some 7,500 miles as the crow flies from Moscow, a shaman in the South American Andes. He too claims to be living in the Christian tradition. St. Anthony amid tinctures and powders, promises of salvation made by millennia-old Native American medicine, and the crucifix also belongs here. Perfume is divine breath, draft liquor is holy water. Ancient native traditions mixed with the good news. Who would have a right to pass judgment on the earnestness of this believer? And yet the admixture of global influences with the contents of Christianity does have its perils.
A religious mishmash like that may be in the offing for us. I don't find that very appealing. The religions are very probably being swept up in the process of globalization of goods, merchandise, and infrastructures. I believe this would take all the good taste and all the zest out of them and leave behind a kind of wishy-washy generality, which I find horrible.
Und alle Würze verlieren werden und so ein allgemeines Wischiwaschi dabei herauskommt, das mir schrecklich zu sein scheint.
Religiosity should, as long as it can, hang on to its locality, where it comes from, where it has its being.
Wo sie herkommt, wo sie ist.
Native magic dances in Frankfurt, shamanic rites in Berlin. Esoteric is how the business of religious patchwork from all over the world is described. The scope of salvation promises is breathtaking and keeps on growing. An expansion market, the business community would call it, lucrative and future-oriented. An answer to the crisis of Christianity in the Western world. While the need for a church may be small in Germany, the need for spirituality is all that much greater. Traditional palmistry, also called chiromancy, now brand new with the computer. The esoteric religions have no problem dealing with the modern world. Pantare, everything flows in merry confusion. A danger for Christianity, or a viable alternative?
Something artificial can never take the place of something that is alive. Just as in India, Hinduism and Buddhism possess an inner strength because, unlike something invented, they are simply not manipulable. More capable of growth, but not manipulable. So too Christianity is a reality, which, even apart from theology and faith, is deeply rooted in the relationship of man to God, and thus has a primordial force that nothing artificial or manufactured can ever possess.
The high point of a substitute religion is produced by the present day. This is supposed to be a triptych, a modern altar image. It's made of pillowcases on one of which the divine Elvis rested his head. Pop stars are moving into the positions once held by the saints. Christian tradition is becoming a decoration, a jolly event, a gag. The expansive heavens above us into which generations of believers longingly looked have lost their magic. Instead of angels, it now houses hosts of aliens and weird creatures. People have long since begun tracking the secrets of the universe with spaceships. High technology is a new promise. Science is changing the image of God. As far back as the ancient myths, people told of the longing of mankind for the sky, the place where God resides. In the second half of the 20th century, the time had come. Science and technology opened up the universe. Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin would be the first man in space, closer to God than any other. On April 12, 1961, Gagarin circled the globe. His flight marked the start of a new era, the age of science. And it would be cosmologists who ventured this thesis: there is another way to find God than the way of religion, the way of physics. One day it is destined to prove the existence or non-existence of God. Yuri Gagarin, on Earth a celebrated superstar, but in the cosmos he discovered what modern astronomy would later even more impressively prove: that man is microscopically small, a cipher in some solar system on the edge of a galaxy, and there are millions of them, perhaps billions. Since Galileo, an image of the world in which the Earth and humanity stand at the core of creation has become something quite different. Nothing apart from the moon circles the Earth. Everything, on the other hand, revolves around the sun. And meanwhile, many cosmologists regard it as certain that there could also be life on other planets. This belief is also shared by Stephen Hawking, arguably the best-known mathematician and physicist in the world. Hawking is totally paralyzed, including his vocal cords. He can only still move his thumb. This is how he operates a voice synthesizer to make himself understood. Perhaps the universe is a self-enclosed unit, says Hawking, without a beginning or an end. What need would it have for a creator? If one day we find out the formula for the world, one that explains everything, he says, then we will all have a part in this knowledge. That would be the greatest imaginable triumph of human thinking, because then we would know the mind of God. For many scientists, God and the results of scientific study are anything but opposites. They won't let anybody take away their image of the Creator. Many others, however, only believe in their formulae. Particle accelerators designed to research matter down to the last detail. They too are cathedrals of our time. A time in which natural science seems to be becoming a monotheistic religion. The scientists carry their ever more sensational findings like monstrances before them. The wisdom of bygone days and the increased foundations of our culture to which Christianity belongs have been long since shelved for once and for all by scientists like physicist Steven Weinberg.
I think that the work of science doesn't prove anything about the existence of God, but it does remove one of the ancient arguments for God, namely that there's no other way we can understand the world around us. Now, but that's an old story, of course. Now, for many years, we've understood how the rain works, and we don't need to imagine a supernatural deity having to decide each time that it will rain. So this just continues the process. But it leaves people free to believe in God if they wish. It just removes what it takes away the idea that by studying nature you will find the evidence of God. You know, there's a psalm that says, "The heavens proclaim the glory of God," and that's not really true. The heavens don't proclaim the glory of God, or if they do, they don't do so any more than anything else in nature. The stars are just balls of hot gas heated by nuclear reactions in their core. in a way, it's a sad thing, the demystification of nature, but I think it's a necessary process, and the discovery of a final theory will be a step which perhaps only the discovery of science in the 17th and 16th centuries compares with in importance.
The demystification of nature also takes place on a daily basis in the laboratories of the fertility physicians. An egg and a sperm cell are brought together in a test tube, perhaps first genetically tested and found in order, and they no longer need to be implanted into the body of the mother. Humanity is taking creation itself into its own hands and beginning to turn the huge wheel of evolution. Conception in the test tube, still branded in the late 70s by many ethicists in the Catholic Church as highly questionable, has long since become a routine procedure. Tens of thousands of test tube babies have already joined the population. Private fertility clinics are cropping up all over the place, not least because they promise to do good business. Here in the British clinic Bourne Hall is where the first test tube baby came into the world in 1978. Her scientific father, Professor Robert Edwards, somewhat later coined the questionable phrase.
Yes, I think sometimes ethics has to adjust to progress, and sometimes it is the reverse, that what we do must respond to the ethical pressures of society.
Two developments joined together just in time for the dawn of the new millennium: the decoding of human heredity and technicized fertility medicine, long since a flourishing branch of industry. Some $250 million is spent in the United States alone on test tube fertilization and the genetic testing of embryos. The way to designed humans, because people can make corrections on hereditary attributes in the test tube, and these will then be passed on to future generations. These invasive procedures into the embryonic tract are still condemned by the ethics commissions, but the front is beginning to break down. After all, who could perpetually resist the temptation to correct a susceptibility toward cancer, coronary problems, or Alzheimer's disease once and for all? And is it not a Christian duty to prevent illness? Great conflicts are in the offing. On the one hand, the Christian obligation to help, and on the other, the sin of trying to play creator. Chromosomes under the microscope. They contain heredity, the building plans of life. Until now, they were full of mysteries. Now heredity has been totally decoded in conjunction with a gigantic worldwide project, and it all took place even faster with the aid of robots. The entire human genome is already a known quantity. Researchers like molecular biologist Bill Hazeltine then want to cross another borderline. They want to increase the human lifespan by interfering with the genotype. Eternal life for everybody?
In terms of how long, for example, a human being can live, we're not talking about 5 or 10 or even 50 years from now, about the ultimate expansion of human life. There are things that are alive that are 10,000 years old. There are trees. There's, from a biologist's point of view, we're made from the same materials. I don't see why we can't do as well as a tree and live a very, very long time. So in terms of that type of expansion, I'm not sure there is a natural limit.
This idea, ultimately born from the fear of death, has always fascinated mankind. The desire to put ourselves on the same level with the gods had already appeared in the earliest writings of the human race. Paradise on Earth, an attempt that has left its imprint on the thinking of the modern era. People want to create their own paradise here and now. Paradise now. To live in a perfect body without suffering and without any risks. Genetically engineered manipulation with its possibility of designing human beings will bring this vision one step closer. A few scientists, still very few, have second thoughts about such tendencies, like French Anderson, the pioneer of genetic therapy.
fear in terms of my work is that people will try to use it in ways that they think will be good, like a memory enhancing gene. And then we discover 10 years later that anybody who got that developed schizophrenia or whatever. So I'm really the concern that this is a technology that is so powerful that it is frightening. I'm frightened by the power of it. Okay, we're starting.
Okay, so what we're interested in looking at, right,
to be certain that genetic engineering, which is a powerful technology and simple to do, doesn't go like nuclear technology, which was also a powerful technology to build atom bombs, but it wasn't simple to do. So people couldn't just do it. High school students can do gene transfer.
But science's promise of happiness is stronger than our fear of the consequences, and responsibility only reaches as far as this world demands.
This is why I think it is very important for Christianity to retain the horizon of the beyond in life, not toward the goal of reducing responsibility, but rather to create true responsibility, because what I do does not simply lead into a nebulous void. I am rather responsible and can be called to account for whether I have done these things that correspond to my task and my abilities, in what I am and what I can be and what I can give. This is why I think we should have more courage to speak in the right way about the beyond.
Anything that can be done will be done. There are no examples of the contrary in the history of science. And when people play creator, then they want to venture to take the final step, making identical copies of human beings. It is more than probable that at this very moment people are working feverishly on cloning in many labs throughout the world. Cloning possesses the capability of making people truly immortal, like gods. Sects have already come into being that have written just that on their banners. The Elohim under their leader Rael are enjoying great popularity. Worldwide, some 50,000 people already belong to this clone sect, which employs its own researchers. They are working on a cloning method and offer their services over the internet. It is said to cost $200,000 to have yourself cloned. Brave new world. Cloning is a highly promising commercial venture. The growth market in the fertility industry, which is especially booming in the United States, has been longingly awaiting this possibility. And it would even allow transplantation medicine to experience a quantum leap. Thanks to cloning, we would have organs available which, just as in identical twins, would not be rejected. The idea here is not to use human copies as organ banks. It would be conceivable to cultivate organ deposits from cloned embryonic tissue, which would then be transplanted. One more border crossed. Once again, the object of the exercise is the reduction of suffering, but the danger of turning life into a raw material is greater than ever before.
It cannot be too clearly or radically stated that the Church is again about to miss out on the moment when it should say no with absolute radicality.
In dem es darum ginge, mit einer absoluten Radikalität Nein zu sagen.
A no that would be lost if we failed to mention man is a person and not raw material.
Der Mensch ist Person und ist nicht Rohstoff.
In fact, just about all those elements that make us human are now available to us. A quest for truth, for orientation. Science is as eager to pursue this as is the Christian faith. But making sure this quest serves human beings without degrading them to the level of biological machines to satisfy some blind urge toward research, this must remain a Christian demand.
I believe that the search for truth does not serve retaliation, but rather reconciliation, and that it forms the basis for a peaceful living together of people who are diverse and always will be. This is what we Christians should strive for. And it's no easier today than it ever was. Yet in view of the globally conjoining dangers and experiences, I believe it might be a little easier to comprehend.
The search for truth. On this endless road mankind is following, the message of the Rabbi from Nazareth offers orientation. In Jesus, God became man. This is what Christian dogma teaches us. Since those days, God is no longer distant and removed, but right up close. He joins with people, such as here in the Roman Church of San Egidio, where every year a huge banquet is held for the poor and needy of the city. Human beings, it is in their form that Jesus rises again, ever anew, even 2,000 years after his death. They are the yardstick by which all political and scientific activities must allow themselves to be measured. They are the obligatory reality of the Christian faith, now and in the future. The march of Christianity as we enter the third millennium. It has encountered every form of suffering and of friendship, all the drudgery and lightness of life. What remains is more than a recollection. It is the belief that despite all suffering, life stands under the protection of God. And this history will come to a good end.